Hello, everybody. Here we are again, trying to do what we can. So this is going to be a quicker lecture because I want to get to a project that we're going to do. So generally, this is sort of a fun project to do during the fall and during the Halloween season because we're going to be taking a look at the image of the witch. But I think it should still be fun in the spring. So basically, what I'm going to do as far as this goes is I'm going to introduce a little bit in feminist theory and the work of Silvia Federici. And we're going to take a look at that in order to take a deeper look at an art project that looks at the image of the witch and turn it into a project that you all will conduct on the discussion boards. So I'm basically going to briefly discuss this. We have a video to take a look at, and then we'll be able to apply this to an active project. Okay, so today, like I said, taking a look at feminist theory. Oops. Taking a brief look at feminist theory in order for us to go a little bit deeper into the works of Silvia Federici. Here. And essentially what Federici does, I'll go into more detail in a little bit, is she goes in the analysis of the exploitation of women and workers. We'll see what that means. In the early stages of capitalism. And overall, she uses this to explain the witch trials in Europe and the Salem witch trials as well in the Americas. And she goes into detail as to how these things are actually deeply connected. In fact, she goes as far as to say that capitalism really couldn't have developed without this intersection with patriarchy and domination of the feminine. Women specifically, but broadly the feminine. So, and the second part of this is we're looking briefly at Federici's work in order to help us look at an artist project, Frances Denny, which I'll go into in a little bit, who uses the image of the modern witch as a way to explore contemporary femininity and patriarchy. And like I said, this is usually more fun to do during Halloween time because we're looking at witches and such, but we're in strange times, so the spring works as well. So first, let's take a look at Federici's work. I have a broad image here. Zoom out a little bit here. So here's Federici over here on the right. And again, a lot of these notes are also available if you all were to take a look on our canvas. I have the notes posted, and I built from the notes and the video we will watch in order to kind of take a look at this. I just want to briefly introduce what Federici is working on, so we can have some context before we go any deeper into her actual project in the video in just a little bit. So basically, Federici is a Marxist feminist scholar, and she's really unique because she incorporates an analysis. This is so much completely critiquing Marx, but is adding to it. I'll go into a little bit more what that means. But the two basic things that she takes a look at is how gender inequality is not only inherent in capitalism, so it's something that is necessarily a part of capitalism to make it function, but she also, it goes a long way in her time, but also I think it's really applicable in our contemporary times, is to explain contemporary issues. It is not necessarily a separate thing from capitalism, but kind of an essential part in the overall problems that we see in society and any sort of patriarchal violence, including domestic violence, sexual violence, LGBTQIA plus violence, anything that sort of has that, as we talked about before, our hierarchies of the masculine on top and the feminine on the bottom. This is what essentially patriarchy is. It's not necessarily strictly with men versus women, but it's more about masculine and attributes we commonly associate with masculine in American society, such as strong, independent, domineering over the feminine things of being emotional and weak and things like that. And these are often set up in this binary and established in this order here, which Federici would go on to argue that this is an essential part of what helps maintain capitalism, so they're kind of mutually reinforcing each other. So domination in the economic sphere also leads to domination at home, in religion, and society and politics. It kind of has a cascading effect and a mutual effect. So the effect goes both ways. So again, she's and specifically what Federici does, going on to this part here, is she challenges the traditional Marxist notions of class. So initially, Marx's writings here, as a conflict theorist, believe that society can be usefully analyzed at the level of the antagonistic relationship between workers and bosses. And what I mean here is what we talked about kind of throughout what conflict theorists look at. The antagonism being um, a relationship, and relationships are always the key part in conflict theory. The relationship of having opposite goals. And as we talked about, put it very simplistically, is bosses essentially want to make profit and have lower wages, while workers want higher wages. So this is the antagonism between workers and bosses in a very simplistic sense. And Marx would go on to argue that this antagonistic relationship, so this initial relationship here, goes on to affect a bunch of different parts of society. So the political, the social, the economic, even the religious or family, maybe the family as well. So all these realms are affected by this initial relationship between bosses and workers. So these inequalities are cascading. So what Federici does is she sort of takes this as a starting point, essentially the antagonistic part. But she says how essentially this isn't enough to just look at asexual or non-gendered class of people and see how they have an antagonistic relationship, but that gender plays an essential role in how not only how this is maintained, so how we have it in the current society for things like the gender gap, a gender wage gap, but also in the past how capitalism initially developed. Okay, so here's an example. So we had two examples. One when we talked about the prohibition from the conflict theorist perspective during our discussion of deviance, that essentially prohibition wasn't about morality or about how drinking was bad. It was more about how the boss didn't want their workers to show up drunk the next day, or secondarily, and maybe more importantly, how bars and pubs at the time of prohibition or just before it were some of the main places where people actually unionized or got together and complained about their bosses. So by closing down the bars, by getting rid of alcohol, there was a hope of maintaining the order or the interests of the boss. That's one aspect of it. And essentially then, if we were to take this further, that is a specific example, Marx would argue, and most conflicts would argue, that the relationship between workers and bosses spirals into all relationships, like we had here. And so the antagonism is addressed, and there's no longer a boss-worker antagonism. So Federici explains this in a deeper way by saying the patriarchal relationships, and like we set up here, masculine better than feminine, were what made all this possible. So here, essentially, she would say that the boss's goal is to pay the worker as little as possible, hence making more profit, and extract as much work as possible from the worker. Meaning that if the more you could get somebody to work, the more hours you could get someone to work during the day, and the more items they produce, or the more time they spend, and the least amount you could pay them, the better. And one of the main things that made this really possible at the earliest stages of capitalism was this gender identity of man, quote unquote, at work and women at home. So this division of labor, the separation between men and women, where men do work that is worth being paid for, and women staying at home, essentially you can effectively get a person to work a double shift. So if you could have somebody, rather than having to, for example, if somebody prior to this division worked 5 or 6 hours a day and then had to go home or worked at home to then clean clothes, make food, take care of the kids, etc., then you only get 5 or 6 hours a day of work. In this case, you could actually have somebody come for 12, 15 hours a day and have them work all day. Well, they have somebody at home that takes care of all the rest of that, the home labor. And by effectively then only paying that person for the time they're at work, you're getting the rest of it for free. So it's kind of like, I guess, in a tragic sort of way, a 2-for-1 deal. So you get the work of 2 people for the wages of 1. So the man gets paid and the woman stays at home. And what eventually ends up happening then is that there is, again, a really little hierarchy here, is that essentially men's work is more valuable than women's work, or the masculine is more important than the feminine, because the men get paid and women don't get paid. Meaning that over time, this becomes something that Federici would argue seems to be natural. It seems we kind of forgotten the history that it started off as something sort of artificial, and over time it means that women and homework is less valuable, anything involving care is less valuable, and should be paid less or not paid at all, while work done at the workplace, rather than work done at home, work done at the workplace is worth wages, and therefore that is more valuable. Because you can't survive in our society, capitalist society, without making money. So over time then, this naturalizes the devaluing of women in feminine work and leads to justification and dehumanization and violence. So Federici would go on to argue that this is what essentially 2 big acts of violence, the witch trials and colonization, were justified. So the witch trials, as Federici would argue in her book, Caliban the Witch, target independent women, property owners, or any families that had non-traditional sorts of structures. Traditional meaning this new tradition they're trying to set up between men at work, women at home. If you were contrary to that, if you're an independent woman or a man that was more equitable in the way things were done, this was an extreme acts of violence to force the gender relationships to happen. And again, over time, we forget that this was had to be done in force. It's anything but natural, is this gender separation. And Federici also connects this to colonization as a part of moving into the Americas, bringing this European style of capitalism and production necessitated the destruction of any other form of gender relationships. So especially matrilineal or matriarchal societies, those would be a threat to the capitalist patriarchal structure. So witch trials are actually imported or exported to the Americas, Latin America, United States, North America, in order to force these new habits into the New World and naturalizing them there. So it makes it easier to colonize, to exploit when European gender roles are exported to colonized people. It helps facilitate a takeover. So that's the basic introduction of what Federici was doing. So let's go ahead and I'll post this link in the discussion notes. But here's another more direct image of what Federici, in her own words, is talking about.
I still believe that you cannot understand contemporary capitalism without Marx. In many ways, it's irreplaceable. We still live in the system that he has described so powerfully. And being able to anticipate the developments that are taking place today. That's why I say, yes, let's celebrate Marx and let's celebrate capital, but also realize that we need to see what is not taken into account. I think I began to read Marx when I was probably 18, 16, 17. In school, I had a teacher, I grew up in a communist town. And my teacher, Italian teacher, he was a Marxist. But then I began to study more systematically when I went to the United States. And then really, really more seriously with the feminist movement. Feminism was a whole beginning of seriously engaging with Marx. Yeah, interesting enough. And I always say we learned a lot from Marx. Marx gave us the tool to criticize him. Because when we read the description of the reproduction of the workforce, he wrote for us. He literally wrote, but we had to change the subject. We had to bring in new subjects. It's only actually in Capital Volume 1 that Marx deals with the question of women's and labor. No? And I think he wrote some of the most powerful pages on the exploitation of women, the exploitation of women and children. I think that in the whole Marxist, socialist, revolutionary tradition, few have, with so much pungency, analyzed the way capitalism exploits labor, and particularly the labor of women. At the same time, one of the limits of Marx is that he concentrates on the position of women, either in the bourgeois family or in terms of their work experience. He concentrates on their place in wage work, in wage industrial work. The criticism is that he does not see, the work of women in the process of reproduction as important in capitalist accumulation. That when it comes to an analysis of capitalist exploitation, right, he has a limited view of the ways in which capitalism exploits women, exploits women's labor. He does not see that the exploitation of women in capitalism, in the history of capitalism, even in the period of the Industrial Revolution, was not limited to wage industrial work, but actually, took place on a much broader arena, extending and to the whole sphere of domestic activity, those domestic activity that are crucial for the reproduction of the workforce. Marx very acutely, he recognizes the labor power, the potential that we have to work with potential for exploitation is not something that is naturally given. And particularly, in the work process, is constantly consumed on a day-to-day basis. And so it has to be reproduced. And recognizes that, but sees that process of the reproduction of the workforce as being accomplished completely through commodity production. In other words, the worker gets the wage, and out of the wage buys the commodities that are needed, the food, the houses, etc. And that's how they reproduce themselves. There is no other kind of work that comes in. For example, to prepare the food, right? For example, to make love. For example, to raise the children, etc. There's no sex. It's a totally asexual worker that Marx has in mind. He speaks of procreation, and he says, well, the capitalist class can let the workers take care of that. But no, actually the state intervenes very heavily with all kinds of prohibition, regulation, and this is the criticism that we have. This criticism of Marx's omission of the sphere of reproduction extends to his analysis of primitive accumulation, where the focus of the analysis is on the expulsion of the peasantry from the land, right? The enclosure, the fencing off of the commons, and so forth. And again, I think that analysis, and the formation of a wage working class. I think, again, that analysis was very limited because as I've tried to demonstrate in Caliban and the Witch, clearly other forms, other types of enclosures were necessary. And so I've spoken about the body, the mechanization of the body, and all the practices that were introduced in the 16th, 17th century, to produce a body machines. Capitalism produced. The more important, the steam engine, was the mechanization of the body. Yes, it was. And that study and that attempt to turn all body powers into labor powers is something that has never ended. I think that particularly starting in the 19th century, the question of disciplining the future generation of worker and preparing girls and boys to that kind of mechanization, lowering expectation, the work of lowering expectation, that's very fundamental, right? You cannot do this, you cannot do that because, look, when you're going to have a job, you cannot always do what you desire, etc. That preparation, it's really part of housework. Imagine if the capitalist class had to use, part of the wealth that they accumulate to build an infrastructure, a reproductive infrastructure, replacing all the many tasks the women accomplish in the home. Their level of accumulation would have been drastically reduced. Capitalism needs to always have a population at the bottom, because the work of reproducing labor, the work of reproducing labor power, it's a key determinant in the value of that labor power, a key determinant of the process of accumulation of value, of creation of surplus value. And that means always the need to create, a population, whether it is unpaid domestic workers, whether it is paid domestic worker coming, from the most impoverished parts of the world, and therefore working in conditions often of coercion, as we have today with immigrant women, often working in conditions that are very, very coercive. Or it is people in the plantation. We should not forget that much of the reproductive work that went into the production of industrial proletariat and into this day is work that was done by slave labor. Say racism and sexism are necessary conditions of existence of the capitalist class. When you see the kind of mechanism of exploitation that I've articulated before, how the capitalist class always need a population without rights in the colonies, in the kitchen, in the plantation, which in fact is determinant of the process of value accumulation. When you see that, you realize that racism, sexism are conditions of existence, are not degenerations, but are actually intrinsic elements of the capitalist system of exploitation. And in that way, they represent one of our most important terrain of struggle. I am Silvia Federici. I am a teacher, feminist scholar, and activist, as well as a writer, and this is what I've been for most of my life.
So I just wanted to so I think what Federici was doing was really interesting, right? This idea of taking a look at the witch as an aspect of looking deeper into her society, into our society, seeing these things that maybe she wouldn't have been able to see by using this image. So I wanted to, so this is where we're going to go apply what Federici is doing. Looking at the image of the witch now in contemporary society to look at what feminism means for us, to use it as a way, like Federici did, in an artistic project. So, again, in the early stages of development of capitalism in Europe, many places around the globe, the image of the witch has been negative. And again, often violence has been justified against disobedient or divergent women or the feminine. So following in this, Frances Denny, a photographer and portrait artist, is following the resurgence of the image of the witch. So contemporary society has, at least in the United States, has taken the image of the witch and maybe diverted it or challenged it from previous generations or other incarnations into a positive one, maybe something that's empowering. But essentially, though, what Denny was interested in is to document the contemporary witch through portraiture. So she only had basically two prompts. The idea being that anyone who self-identifies as a witch, and she did this through an interview process, and she found one person, she used that as a reference to find other people, and basically had them come to her as they imagine a witch to be. So whatever that meant to them. So the images that she produced are of women or feminine people, not necessarily just women, feminine people who identify as witches and how they portray that image to the world. Let's take a quick look, and I'll link this in our notes as well. So Frances Denny. So essentially, then she came up with this really great online resource where, and I'll show a few here. We'll have the link attached of different women who identify as a witch. And essentially all these are kind of self-posed. She helped them pose, but the clothes that they wear and the locations that they do were negotiated between Denny and the person identifying as a witch. So all these images that you see are what this person sees as the witch or witchy in contemporary society. So you know, with a very broad array of images and people of shapes and sizes, colors, and clothing and styles. And what I wanted to do with this is for us to kind of follow along with our project. And generally, this is done in groups when we do this live in class. But this can be done on your own, or if you end up choosing a group, if you have people you've been working with or connected to, feel free to connect with them and do this however you can, whether it's connected through social media or Canvas or email or however you want to do this. But to pick, essentially just pick 2 or 3 images that seem particularly relevant to you, captivating to you, and post or describe them in the discussion board. And I think a lot of these have numbers on them. So this, for instance, is number 28 of 86, if you wanted to do that. Or if you could find some way to copy the image and paste it into the discussion board, you could do that. This essentially will be the discussion part of this class, is to take a look at these images and why do they stick out to you. And I have a few prompts down here in this area, but really the essential part is, why does this seem witchy to you, or why doesn't it seem witchy to you? Why is this image captivating or powerful or interesting to you? And to go in and try to describe that, describe aspects of it, and then go into more detail on anything that sort of makes you think of as far as what it means to be a witch in contemporary society. What does the image mean to you? What does it say about femininity or feminism? How about feminine power in our society? Is the witch archetype from the past? How are women currently exist in our society? How do those two things interact? What does it mean to be a witch in contemporary society? Does this make you rethink what feminism means, or make you want to rethink what feminism could mean? So any of these questions, all of these questions, or anything that comes to mind as you're taking a look at these images, please feel free to go into detail and describe them and have a conversation with each other about these things. So we could kind of go deeper into what Federici was talking about, what Denny's doing, and using this idea of the witch as something that could potentially be a way to look a little bit more deeply into what's going on in our society.